welcome to Q&A in the House, streaming live from Parliament House here in Canberra. I'm Stephanie Boris, and to answer your questions today, I'm joined by Liberal Member for Goldstein, Tim Wilson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your recent engagement.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's great to be with you.
Now, first of all, we're a bit late today because it's been pretty hectic in Parliament where you've been sitting in the House of Reps. Labor was wanting to ensure that 9 MPs were referred to the High Court. That's been voted down. So where do we go to from here?
Well, Labor is now self-referring some of their MPs, when I left the chamber anyway, to the High Court, acknowledging that David Feeney is probably ineligible. In fact, everybody seems to think he's ineligible. And that's after we, of course, referred Barnaby Joyce and John Alexander resigned after the referral by Barnaby Joyce and a number of other senators. So the honourable thing to do is, if you know you're ineligible, then you should take appropriate action and either self-refer if there is a question, or equally resign and go to a by-election so that people can have confidence in the Parliament.
Are you confident no government MPs will be found not to be eligible to sit in Parliament?
I am actually quite optimistic about that and quite confident because I've gone through each of the cases that people have raised and I have seen not just no compelling evidence to substantiate it, but actually quite the contrary, compelling evidence in the other direction that they're fine. I hope that's the case. I'm quite sure that's the case. And I think I've been saying for a long time that the problems for the government around citizenship are coming to an end. Obviously, we've had Barnaby Joyce handsomely re-elected, hopefully John Alexander soon as well. But the problems for the opposition are just beginning because they've basically been fibbing to the Australian people, saying, oh no, there's no issues, all of our processes are above board and go to extreme lengths, and now that's just been shown to be a falsehood.
Now, Bob Catter, I think, had the best quote in the House today. He summed it up when he just said, I just want this to stop. So
correct.
Let's get on with some other questions that we've got from our listeners and audience. The first one comes from Jennifer Gator. She's asked
Jennifer.
On the Q&A website. On Monday, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull claimed the debate surrounding the postal survey on same-sex marriage was civil, despite naysayers claiming it could be hurtful and divisive. Now, if this is the case, can you explain why LGBTI health services received an influx of calls during the survey?
Well, firstly, for the vast majority, it was civil. There are always extreme ends to the debate on both sides, and that's not to draw equivalence, but there is always. People on both sides of debates can be very unpleasant. There are people in the LGBTI community who have been very unpleasant towards me. But I think the reason is because what the postal survey did was prompt a lot of gay and lesbian people, trans, intersex, to have to confront anxiety that they faced in previous stages of their life. I wrote an article for the Sydney Morning Herald last year saying that when the original idea of a plebiscite was announced, I went home and I cried. And what came back to me was anxiety that I hadn't had since I dealt with my sexuality, or came out when I was 18. I think what a lot of people have seen, particularly if you're used to living in, inner city areas where you don't see people saying hurtful things, and then you occasionally see people saying on Facebook or Twitter or elsewhere, or maybe even sometimes confronting it, it brings you back to a place in your life that's more difficult. Now, the reality is people are always going to say things that are difficult to hear. There are people, even after a change in the law, who are still going to have a view against both the morality of people having sexual relationships with somebody of the same gender, same sex, as well as accepting the outcome. But one of the great strengths of the LGBTI community is its resilience, because it has had to fight every step of the way for its place in society and at the place at the nation's table, and we're about to have a spectacular win, which is to show the nation that no kid ever need grow up dealing with fear that society isn't going to accept them.
Catherine Bolton is here in Canberra, the ACT, and she's contacted us via Facebook. Her question is, if breastfeeding in Parliament is a stunt, if wearing a burqa is a stunt, then how is proposing to your partner not just another stunt, and should the floor of Parliament not be kept for business of Parliament?
It absolutely should be kept for the business of Parliament. And the reality is we just went through a $100 million 10-week debate about the legal standing of mine and many other people's relationships. And I gave a speech on the amendment bill, the bill before the Parliament to amend the Marriage Act. And at the conclusion of it, I gave thanks to lots of people who supported me and many other people throughout this debate. And when your own relationship has been voted upon by the Australian people, it ceases to be an exclusively private matter. I would much rather have it been an exclusively private matter. It was a time to show my thanks to many people, but mostly to my partner, because he has sat beside me and I've sat beside him throughout this whole debate. We've had the nation judge our relationship and make decisions. Not just ours, many others as well. And you had the chance to do that, Catherine. So when you have the right to be able to vote on my relationship, as you have done, and the legal standing of it, then getting up and acknowledging in federal parliament has made it into a matter for the parliament.
Are you surprised that you caught flack for that?
Oh, no, I'm not surprised. I knew there'd be a small section of the community who'd feel that way. But the vast bulk of the Australian people has said nothing but incredibly positive things and found it very touching. And I think it's just that disconnect in misunderstanding that while people were filling out their survey forms, people's lives were being ultimately judged and their relationships were being ultimately judged. Now, it probably doesn't feel that way when you're ticking a yes or a no box, but it certainly felt that way from where many couples were sitting. That's also another reason why there has been anxiety. And that's why I think there should be a respect for the fact that mine, among many other relationships, have been forced into the political environment, and so that's become a topic for Parliament. But the other critical thing, it's very important, is to send a message to the Australian community. The people in positions of influence, like myself, take the opportunity to show that there's more than just the legislative path. There's a human dimension behind this change, and the human dimension bringing it about means that now same-sex couples are able to be in a position, after a 10-week debate, after $100 million being spent, of uttering those words, "Will you marry me?"
Andrew Buckhorn is another person that has been writing into us. He says, following the successful yes vote in the same-sex marriage plebiscite, is it time now to revisit another of Mr Turnbull's pet projects, and that's whether Australia should become a republic or not?
Well, the truth is, if you actually want an Australian public, I don't think now is a good time to prosecute the argument. I'm a sort of constitutionalist. I'm not a big fan of change. In 1999, I voted yes, and I did. And if the same model were proposed today, I probably would vote yes, or something very similar to it. If it was a very similar proposal, I just don't think we're going to get that again. And I'm not a direct election fan. The groundwork hasn't been done to push for a republic. And the reality is the monarchy, or at least the ideals of the monarchy, are more popular than they have been for a long time. One of the reasons I've diminished interest in the republic is after, let's face it, the Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull years, there's something quite comforting about knowing there's a benign political force sitting above our parliament, and if necessary can intervene so that democracy is allowed to work, but stability and order can also be maintained.
Okay, let's move on to something completely different and talk the economy. We've had some interesting questions and comments on this issue, so policy.
Bring it on.
Yep. Okay, so we've got Dante Christan in Western Sydney. She says the government's been advocating a cut to company tax, and you've obviously been trying to push that through. The argument that you've given is lowering company tax stimulates investments in the Australian economy. Mm-hmm. If you really believe that, why stop at 25%? Why not go lower to 20%? How do you come to that figure?
That's a fantastic question. I love it. In fact, in my first speech, I argued for a consistent tax rate across of tax rates, including company tax, and I argued for 20. I'd rather 15. And as a broad proposition, it's true. We've never lived in an age where capital and talent is more mobile, and so taxing them firstly is inefficient, but equally makes us uncompetitive as a nation. So would I like to lower it further? Absolutely. But we still need to raise the revenue to fund health, education, all the basic services that Australians have not unreasonably come to expect. The key task, and I've written about this before, is we have to look at rebasing the tax system away from just company and income tax, which are the two biggest contributors to the tax system, and looking at other ways to share the tax load. And that's just not a federal tax level, that's at a state tax level as well. So the point is right. Good on you. Good question.
But with the 25% the government's got at the moment, do you think you will get it through Parliament for all businesses? Because it is facing a lot of opposition at the moment.
Well, it's facing a lot of opposition because we have a Labor Party that's disconnected from economic reality in understanding what actually drives the investment we need to secure the job creation that Australians need. Now, as competition, tax competition around the world continues, it's going to become self-evident. I mean, I could do as the government does in question time and start quoting Bill Shorten back to himself about how company tax rate increases.
No, I think we'll have people turn off.
But that's the reality. It actually leads to job creation. Bill Shorten agrees with it. We agree with it. We actually want to give Australians jobs.
Okay, another economy question from Karan Sharma from Adelaide. She says, do you think Australia can continue to sustain economic growth without increasing migration?
I do actually, because while migration can be a contributor to economic growth, it isn't the sole determinant of that. I think we need to look at incredible opportunities that exist to drive our services sector, particularly in services trade. This is all gets very technical in different areas of trade, but my background's trade policy, by the way, originally. But there are industries that we can drive and reform to actually create the export industries we need for the 21st century. We've got to look at industries where we can be competitive on quality rather than just on price, because we know if it's based on volume and price, we're not going to be competitive. But if it's quality, say healthcare services, that's an area where people pay a premium. Obviously, it affects their physical health, so they're prepared to pay a premium for the best quality service that's available. Value-added manufacturing is part of a supply chain attached to our agricultural industries to feed and provide the food bowl for Southeast Asia in the 21st century. There are lots of ways we can do it. Having a nuclear industry. I've argued for that before. It's not news, but
it's a dangerous one, though, isn't it?
In
terms of the debate.
Well, yeah, but it's also, as legislators and as leaders of this nation, we have to rise to the challenge of it, and it's a sort of discussion that we shouldn't be afraid to have, because I'm interested in what we need to do to build Australia's future, and build Australia's future where you can see your opportunities in where you fit into this nation and the economic opportunity you need, the same way I believe that for social opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's take a look at freedom of speech. That's very
Good topic.
Much come into the spotlight this week for a number of reasons.
Yes.
One of them being the visit of Milo Yiannopoulos to Parliament House. Now, you didn't attend that, did you?
I didn't. I was in party room meetings, so I had
Would you have gone if you had the opportunity?
I had mixed views. The truth is, the main reason I would have gone is to see who else turned up. I'm not a Milo fan. I think he doesn't describe himself as conservative or liberal or anything that I would describe myself as. I think he is crude and crass and lacks civility. And if you're on my side of politics, one of the strongest cases we have for why we believe in free markets, private institutions rather than the government and the public sector taking everything, is to civilise human relationships. And he doesn't seek to do that. So I'm not a big fan, but should he have the right to speak? Of course, because I think the more you give people like this a platform, the more they expose themselves. On top of that, but my general preference would be to ignore him.
Okay, well, that leads into this question from Stephen John from Port Fairy in Victoria. We're going around Australia.
Hey, I love Port Fairy. It's a great town. I've been there in ages. Awesome. It can be quite cold and wet and windy, but that's a good thing. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with rain.
No.
So he says, do you agree that individual rights and freedoms must be circumscribed where they unnecessarily infringe upon another rights or freedoms? So if so, where do you draw the line for limiting freedom of speech? And would you say that freedom of speech is more than the freedom to feel safe and secure in both your public and private life?
Well, so there's a huge interaction of different rights. Before I was elected to Parliament, I served as Australia's Rights Commissioner, so I've had a fair bit of time talking about these things.
Question for you.
Well, it is, and because different contexts sit in how these rights interact depending on the environment. Because if, for instance, on private property in a private home, then you actually have the right. It's not it's got nothing to do with freedom of speech. You can throw anybody out of your home because you have property rights, and so it's got nothing to do with free speech. But in the public square, the most important thing is to have an environment where people do feel free to exercise their rights. And the question we have as legislators is, where do you set the bar around that? And some people say it's vilification. I disagree with that. Some people say it's around offend, when people are offended. I disagree with that. The test is when people feel harassed, which is the point at which me exercising my rights or you exercising your rights inhibits my freedom to do so. And that's a higher bar than just saying, I don't like what you're saying. And so that's how we should be setting a test in law around at what point do people engage in harassing behaviour because it limits other people's freedoms to exercise their rights? But just because you find something difficult to hear isn't the same as meaning it should justify censorship or silence.
Okay, this one is very much, I think, what we're all discussing in here in Parliament constantly. I'm not letting you have a look at it.
That's all right.
Okay. So Ben Morford from North Ryde in New South Wales.
Hey Ben.
He says the Australian Constitution is pretty good, but clearly not perfect, as we've seen just recently here. There's a growing backlog of potential referendum questions. So we've got in terms of Aboriginal voice, republic, race powers, Section 44, mixed 4-year terms, and so on. He says everyone's scared to hold a referendum because it will probably fail. So how can we get good at this whole changing the Constitution business?
Well, that assumes that you believe the Constitution should be changed.
Which he obviously
and
does.
I don't race to that conclusion.
On any of those?
Well, so 4-year terms, I'm actually not a big fan of. I would either rather a 3-year term or a 5-year term. Now,
Fixed?
No, I'm quite relaxed about the Prime Minister setting the election date. I don't mind the current 3-year cycle. I think it's good that people are accountable. The trade-off is if you're prepared to go longer, I'm prepared to broadly consider a 5-year term because then it means each government governs and they can be thrown out afterwards. At the moment, we basically have governments re-elected every time for the first 2 simply because they haven't really had a chance to do anything. But the catch with the Constitution is that Senate terms are double the House term, so you move to a 5-year term, you get 10-year senators. Now, I don't think that's right. They're not. The same is true if you move to a 4-year term, you get 8-year terms in the Senate. So I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't understand why I should get more job security than you, frankly. In fact, I already get 3-year contracts. Most Australians these days don't get that. They might get 2 if they're lucky. So I don't agree with that. In terms of constitutional recognition, that's a very complex issue. I've actually said many things on the record and sort of broadly in favour of doing something in that space. The question is the model, and I don't agree with the model that was put up by by Noel Pearson and co. And it's not because I don't agree with the spirit of it, but I don't agree that that should be entrenched in the Constitution. It's now a discussion whether it should be done legislatively. What were the other ones?
Section 44.
Section 44.
How could you forget that one?
Well, no, but the reality is, I'm not a huge fan of changing Section 44.
But what about the
I was elected to federal parliament to represent my community to protect the interests of this nation. I mean, I don't actually broadly agree with dual nationality, period. I'm a bit conservative in this case, which is you can only really be loyal to one nation at any given time. So I'm not convinced Section 44 does need to be changed. And if you're sitting in the federal parliament and you're voting on matters of foreign policy, I think electors have a right to want to be confident that you're going to choose our national interests over the national interests of another nation.
But on a piece of paper it seems right, but then in practice, I mean, people like Barnaby Joyce, there's no way that he had an allegiance to New Zealand.
No, I accept that. And that's where I think we've got this challenge where maybe we have to look at how it's been interpreted. But I understand the decision the High Court made, which is basically if you create any grey areas where people are allowed in or out, every election cycle you're going to have people referred, and that's a ridiculous way to run a country. So they either took a very strict interpretive test or they let everybody in and they decide to go, no, we're going to boot everybody out and leave it to democracy to solve.
Just finally, this one comes from Lindley O'Keefe from Coombs, just south of here.
Cool.
Hopefully it's a bit warmer there at the moment. She says people worldwide are disillusioned with politicians and the dominant parties. The debating chamber is too often a place for slanging matches or empty until the call to vote, as the party dictates. A new government spends its first months undoing much of the previous government's bills. Is it time that all debate, apart from issues of supply, become conscience votes?
So I think everybody thinks what's happening in the world is new. It's not. What we're actually doing is going back to, I think, or trending back towards the world that existed before the 20th century, politically and in the media. I mean, people talk about, there's all these just, news sites and blogs and things, verify information being circulated, informing people's opinions. They actually used to do that in like the 17th and 18th century. It's called pamphleteering, where anybody would publish information. It would be sometimes be right, sometimes be wrong, designed to influence. We're just getting electronically rather than written form. I think the same is broadly true in politics today as well. I think we're probably trending back towards kind of like colonial era politics where governments will be less stable parliamentarians will be more likely to exercise their views individually rather than as part of a collective. I think there are huge consequences for that, by the way. I don't think it's all good. But let's not be too strong in making big predictions. So that's why I say I think we're trending in that way.
Why do you think that is the case? Why are we going
because,
that way?
I think there are a lot of reasons. I don't think there's a common view about who we are as a country anymore, and that's a consequence of high migration and attitudes towards identity politics. And I think the media is encouraging people, or the way we consume media, I should say, is letting people to constantly self-reinforce their own opinion. That's not helpful, by the way. If you want to do something valuable for democracy, read something you disagree with every single day. And so as a consequence, what you're seeing is not just people not consuming information that would contradict their view, but starting to cast aspersions about the legitimacy of why people hold opinions. So there are people who disagree with me strongly on free speech and, Section 18C, the Racial Discrimination Act. And you get this response, which is the reason you believe that is because, and then we throw in the isms and ists and everything else. And it's actually because I believe that all people should be equal before the law. I want that law changed for the same reason I believe the Marriage Act should change. All people should be equal before the law. And the current form of 18C doesn't make every Australian equal before the law. And so casting aspersions is a tactically very clever way, but it doesn't actually get to the bottom of why people have differences of opinion. And I think that's where we're trending to, and I think we're going to have to get out of that a bit. I also think that everything goes in cycles. We start off with very closed amount of media sources and relatively high degree of trust. We've swung away to lots of media sources with much lower degree of trust, and there'll be a pendulum swing which will move it probably back somewhere in between, where people will pay for news that they think has credibility, or they'll get it free from if they trust the ABC. Am
I allowed to comment on that, or?
Well, no, it's not something to be an anti-ABC comment. Some people don't trust it.
Yeah.
But you get back to a point where people accept that, are prepared to pay and recognise the credibility of a source of media. And that will be probably a helpful trend in the other direction. So let's wait and see.
Well, Tim Wilson, we've managed to get through this chat without the bells ringing, which is incredible. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
On Q&A this Monday, Virginia Trioli will host the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. So if you've got any questions for the Prime Minister, please send them via the Q&A website, Facebook or Twitter. I'm Stephanie Boris, and thank you.
No, I was going to say, Virginia but the Virginia is a tough interviewer, so I'm going to give the PM some tips beforehand, because...
What would be the number one tip?
I really respect Virginia as an interviewer. I used to do a regular sort of thing with her on News Breakfast, and she's not afraid to get straight to the point, but it's always substance-based. And I actually really like watching her when... No disrespect, Tony Jones, but I actually really like watching when she's hosting Q&A, and I think it'll be a fascinating program to watch.
It will indeed.
I might even tune in.
Oh, good. Well, thank you very much for your time, Tim, and thanks for watching.